Hey guys, coming to you live from my house this time, trying to get this video in. So in case you want to watch it tomorrow before class, you can. Where we left off in our notes, we were talking about the Soviet systems. We talked about how Lenin led the revolution, and they executed Tsar Nicholas II, and Lenin becomes the new dictator of Russia. Okay, so then when that happens, they decided to install communism. So the last slide we left off with was this one. And we're talking that communism, with this idea that Karl Marx started, was that everyone was created equal. Not equal in the way that we think about in our country, but equal meaning they took out all the social classes. So there's no rich, there was no middle, and there was no poor. Everyone was treated equally the same. Communism had that one good aspect, which we left off with the last time, and we said the one good aspect was that they set really high production goals for all their factories to produce lots of products to make money. That was the one good thing that came out of communism. But there were a lot of bad things that happened. So if we think about the bad things that happen, that's going to far outweigh the good. Okay, so if we look at the negative aspects, okay, the communist leaders were the same as the czars. People were just as unhappy as they were under Lenin as they were under Tsar Nicholas II. The standard of living, how much money they made, was really poor. People had no freedoms, no rights. They couldn't vote. They were not allowed to speak freely. People who resisted, and resistance could simply be going out in public and talking negatively about the government, they would be arrested. They were sent to forced labor camps. They were exiled to Siberia to live out their life in the coldest area of Russia. This was a really hard time. Russia during this time did very similar to what Hitler did in World War II. They targeted different ethnic groups. They targeted religions they didn't like. And a lot of people were executed. Jews, Muslims, religious leaders, educated individuals. And we might say, well, why did they target scientists or religious leaders? Because leaders had followers. And if people would follow a religious leader, if people would follow an educated person, they would be more likely to question the government. And once people start questioning the government starts losing control. So what the government did, they started taking out those people right away. Okay, so these benefits that they said communism would do, they were not able to invoke onto the population. Okay, we looked a little bit under different things in the Russian system. We talked about collective farms. Last week in our notes when we looked at Ukraine. We said a collective farm, the government controlled everything, even the land. So instead of having all these small little farms all over the place, they would set up one big farm, a collective farm, owned and operated by the government. So they would make these people, okay, work really long hours and work really hard, but the people weren't paid any money. So there's few incentives for these farmers to work hard, which really led to people not working hard. We gave the example last week in our notes. If we had two cashiers and one cashier worked really hard and did a great job, at the end of the week they got paid one wage. And their co-worker, maybe their best friend, who disappeared for a while, didn't do the greatest job, would get paid the same wage. Gave them no incentive to work hard. Okay, once people started not working hard, the production is going to go down. Okay, factories at this time, factories focused on things called heavy industries. A heavy industry was a business that produced products used in another business. So if I was making a dishwasher and I sold dishwashers, a heavy industry would be like the company making the hoses or the filters, and they would sell them to my business. That's a heavy industry. Okay, so the situation is only going to get worse by more wars. So World War II breaks out in 1939. Russia, or the Soviet Union at this time, will be on the same side as the United States and France and the United Kingdom. Okay, Germany is going to set out to take over the world, and all those fine details we'll talk about in our World War II unit. But just a little short section on World War II and the Soviet Union. Okay, Hitler's going to try to take over the Soviet Union, the largest country in the world. So he's going to invade with lots of men. And within 6 months, in 1941, the German troops were right outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, just like Napoleon did, okay, in the 1800s. Okay, so Hitler had a great plan. They had a great military. They're going to take over. Okay, but the Soviet Union took a stand, and they put all their men out to fight to the very last end. And Russia, okay, the Soviet Union is actually going to be okay here. And we might say, well, how would they do that? If Germany had the upper advantage, Germany's right outside the capital city. How did the Soviet Union pull it off? Well, we should be able to answer the question because it's going to be the same answer as what happened to Napoleon. Napoleon was right outside of these major cities and he was forced to retreat. So we have to think, why did Napoleon retreat? He retreated because his supply routes were cut off because winter started. And the same thing is going to happen to Hitler and his troops. Winter started, the supply routes were cut off. Okay, they couldn't maintain their troops, their weaponry, they didn't have enough food, they didn't have enough shelter. And Hitler, even though he didn't want to, okay, is going to be forced to retreat. They're going to leave, they're going to surrender those troops that were outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and they're going to have to accept the loss. Okay, Hitler is going to back up, he's going to regroup, but he was never able to take over the Soviet Union. So the Soviets were able, in 1945, to push the Germans all the way back to Berlin, as the United States and France were closing in from the other side. Germany ends up losing this war. The Soviet Union was saved, for the most part, again, because of their geography, because of the climate that they have. During World War II, the Soviet Union was one of the hardest countries hit. They lost about 20 million Russians in this war. Because of that, and when the war ended, okay, even though the Allied powers, the United States and France and the UK, didn't really like the Soviet Union or Joseph Stalin, because of the amount of loss they had, they did give them all those little countries that we talked about earlier. The Baltic states, Belarus, Moldova, were given to the Soviet Union kind of to make up for those losses. So the Soviet Union just gained land after World War II. As time goes on, when World War II ends, the Soviet Union is going to be one of the most powerful countries in the world. At this time, the United States is considered number one. And the reason the United States was considered the most powerful country in the world was because the United States used 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, okay, showing the world that we were the greatest. Okay, the Soviet Union, being large in size, okay, is going to compete with that, and a war is going to start called the Cold War. Now, the Cold War has nothing to do with weather, and it has nothing to do with winter. Cold was referring to the fact that no fighting actually occurred between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It got really, really close, okay, a couple of times, all right, but no shots were actually fired. It was cold. Okay, this was going to be a war about technology. Okay, so the Soviet Union at this time had a lot of technology. They had money, they had power, they had weaponry, nuclear weapons, jets, planes, submarines, all the same things the U.S. had. Okay, they had a huge area of land, and remember, if you had power and money and land, you were going to be considered a powerful nation. So at this time, Russia and the United States are going to be considered superpowers. Okay, a superpower is a country that has lots of power and lots of influence in the world. So the Cold War is going to be one of the longest wars, without fighting again, okay, that takes place in modern day history. So if we look at the Cold War, okay, it was specifically with our nation, the U.S. Okay, we're going to compete over things like the space race. Who's going to get to space first? And if I ask this question in class, most students will say, well, the United States got to space first. And that wasn't true. Russia actually beat us to space, but we kind of trumped them when we landed on the moon. Okay, so we were trying to outdo each other during these years. So if we look at this time, it occurs mostly through the 1950s to the 1980s. Both countries spent a huge amount of money. We got a lot of great scientific things out of it, but there was no clear winner of this war. Okay, the Cold War impacted Russia negatively because of the number of dollars that they actually spent on this. They spent more money on troops and technology instead of investing in their industries and their population. So they had great scientific investments, but their population kept getting more poor. Okay, in the 1980s, they also received a new leader. His name is going to be Mikhail Gorbachev, and I know my head is blacking out his, but Mikhail Gorbachev is there. Mikhail Gorbachev is going to change the Soviet Union forever. Gorbachev is going to look at communism, and he's going to understand that communism was not working anymore. The population was upset. Nobody's making money. So he's going to start changing things. He's going to try to change it so a revolt wouldn't happen. So he promoted openness and economic restructuring. He began radical reforms, unlike anyone that came before him. So if we look at some of the reforms that he made, he introduced a policy called glasnost. A lot of us had this vocab word incorrect in our vocabulary assignment. Openness was really the law that said you are open, you're free to speak your opinions, to say what you wanted, to write what you want. It's really the freedom of speech. Okay, and they didn't have the fear of being sent off to Siberia or executed for their opinions. His other reform that was just as important was perestroika, which is economic restructuring. What this means is he's going to say all businesses should not be owned and operated by the government. People should have the opportunity to open a business, run the business, be the CEO. He introduced privatization at this time. So for the first time in decades, people went out and started their businesses. These were all great things for Russia. Problem was, it kind of happened too late. Okay, with their new freedoms, people are going to say, let's get rid of communism. Let's do something different. So in 1991, democratic revolutions took place across Eastern Europe and Russia. In 1991, their first president was elected. His name is Boris Yeltsin. They're now going to change their name to the Russian Republic. All those little nations on the west-hand side, Ukraine, the Baltic states, all received independence at this time. So their new challenges, okay, they were communists for such a long period of time, they're not going to bounce back. Okay, so people miss the security. They had a job. They're now moving to that market economy. Okay, they had a democracy, but they had to work through it. There was a lot of problems here, okay, in their area. Now that's where we're going to stop today. We're going to do a short little video on Russia in modern time in our next clip. Okay, so we'll see you next time.